Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the Lunch Hour Lecture Committee and to the Society for the Promotion of Roman Studies for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. The Roman Society is having its 100th anniversary this year, and this lecture is part of the event celebrating that occasion. Okay, my topic today is the end of Roman Britain, and this is quite a large topic, and I have a little amount of time. So I'm going to try and give you an overview of some of the key issues we need to think about in studying this issue. Now, the first point I want to address, I guess, is why discuss this now? Why is it a timely topic, as I believe it is? Well, first of all, the sort of personal dimension is that I'm currently involved in excavations, as just mentioned, at the legionary fortress of Caerleon in South Wales with my colleague, Dr. Peter Guest of Cardiff University. And we're excavating the interior of the fortress on the site of a possible storage or warehouse building. And in that excavation, we have, we think, uncovered some of the evidence of the late or possibly sub-Roman archaeology that's increasingly coming up on sites across Britain, and which we're particularly sort of pleased to have hit upon. We're still in the process of working through the interpretation of this. But just to give you an idea, in the trench you can see there, we have the aisle of a large Roman building, as I said, a probable warehouse, and around that you can hopefully see a few small walls, as is characteristic of Roman archaeology in Britain, but these are possibly late or sub-Roman walls, and we have yet to get precise dates on them, but certainly they relate to the topic I'm talking about today, so that's kind of a personal dimension. A second reason, more widely, is that 2010 may be the anniversary of the end of Roman Britain in AD 410, which is the traditional date for that event. I'll be going into some of the issues with that date in a few minutes, but to suffice it to say, there's lots of things happening this year to do with debating the end of Roman Britain. There's a conference at the British Museum at the weekend coming, so lots of things going on to do with that anniversary. And thirdly, another sort of connection, I think, is that obviously in the UK at the moment, and for the last few years really, there's quite a lot of debate about British identity, about the origins of the different identities within Britain, and certainly the end of the Roman period into the early medieval period is part of the ancient world where there are interesting issues to explore in that connection. Okay, first of all then I want to expand a bit on the nature of the problem that we face in understanding the end of Roman Britain. And one way of thinking about that is to think about the contrast between Britain, or at least much of Britain in AD 200 compared to AD 600. These are very different places in terms of the material culture and in terms of the type of society that we think was operating in these different sort of time windows. In AD 200, Britain had been a Roman province for just over 150 years, having been conquered by the Emperor Claudius in AD 43. It had towns, many of which had large public buildings in them, such as the remains you see there at Wroxeter, so quite a complex settlement pattern, and going with that quite a complex social organization, political hierarchy, lots of different types of objects in circulation, including coins and lots of different kinds of pottery and so on, and a sort of general impression of material complexity. In AD 600, it's quite a different place. The settlement hierarchy is much flatter. Perhaps the social hierarchy is much flatter. We have the emergence, sort of from that point on, I guess, of a series of small kingdoms across the British Isles, very different political organisation then, and a very different material world too. People living in smaller places, some of which looked a bit like that reconstruction from West Stowe. So the question is, what's happened between these two dates? And of course, the traditional date is roughly halfway between those two dates, to create this set of changes. Now, I'm going to show you a quotation here from a great Roman archaeologist who worked at the Institute, Richard Rees. The quote actually it's a bit of a cheat because he's talking about another topic. He's talking about Romanization, but the words fit this situation very well. He says, "A short answer is bound to be wrong, and a proper answer will be long enough for the questioner to lose interest." Now, I'm going to be trying to give you a proper answer in the next half an hour, but I hope you won't lose interest. Now, the other set of issues we need to consider sort of at the outset here is the complexity of the evidence that we have to weigh up in evaluating this particular historical problem. Now, the evidence for the end of Roman Britain is very difficult and intractable in many ways. And we have sort of two broad categories. We have textual evidence, we have archaeological evidence. To deal with the textual evidence first, it is from the textual evidence that we have the specific indications of something changing significantly in Britain in AD 410. But the sources that give us this information are very scattered in terms of time and place. We have the main source, for example, for that event, writing in Byzantium over 100 years after the event. There are other later sources from within the British Isles, but they're very much later, and they have various agendas to do with particularly religious issues. So there's a whole range of problems with our sources. We don't have very thorough textual sources. And another point to make about these is that they, of course, describe only certain things, and they always describe them from a certain point of view. And those things are specific moments, events, and moments to do with the Roman government system, and often also to do with things like warfare and military matters. So they're rather unuseful for everyday life of the full spectrum of people living in Roman Britain at this time. The archaeological evidence is differently problematic, but equally problematic in its way. Archaeological evidence in this period confirms the impression that something significant changed in the early part of the 5th century when it seems many sites were abandoned, some indeed a bit before this time. But that coincides with events which affect the material culture we have available, the types of objects, particularly the ending of the importing of coins into Britain, shipment of coins to Britain by the Roman government, and perhaps linked with that, the end of the production of pottery by the large-scale ceramic industries, and also other changes such as the end of building in stone. Now, the problem is that all of these things are, of course, the main things that archaeologists need to be able to say anything about, well, anything really. And the impression of abandonment may well be simply to do with a change in what people are using in terms of small portable things that usually give us our dates for occupation. Another point, final point to make about the archaeology, of course, is that this type of evidence, with all its problems, also relates to a different kind of process to the historical evidence, the textual evidence. It tends to be sort of give us a longer-term aggregate picture of social processes, particularly relating to the economy, but also to do with how people are expressing their identities. But it's rather a different kind of resolution of social change compared to the textual sources. Okay, now I'm going to go through a few different possibilities of, or possible answers to the question of what ended, and then I'll look at the other sort of questions in my title a bit later on. The first thing to discuss in terms of what ended, and it relates most directly in the first instance at least to the textual evidence, is the end of Roman administration. And the chronology of the end of Roman administration derived from those textual sources, particularly the writer I mentioned in Byzantium a little bit earlier, Zosimus, is up on the slide here. So you can see the first couple of events there relate to a phenomenon which has become increasingly common in Britain in the 4th century, the phenomenon of usurpation, where individuals, particularly powerful generals, are elevated by their soldiers to a claim to the imperial purple. Typically what then happens is that they take some of those troops with them over to the continent to seek their fortune, campaign against the official administration, and then they get killed. And it's a pretty miserable life as a usurper in late Roman Britain, because that's what happens to, well, pretty much all of them. But it seems to happen quite a lot. And of course, this is indicative of an interesting phenomenon to do with the regionalization, if you like, of security in the late Roman period. I'll come back to this theme a bit later on, but what we're seeing here is troops and other people in Britain, and it's happening elsewhere too, wanting more kind of local control over the maintenance of the frontiers in their part of the empire. So there's a clutch of usurpers, Magnus Maximus, who has a relatively long career, Marcus and Gratian, who don't even make it as far as the continent, they get bumped off by their own men. Constantine III, again, a bit more successful, he makes it until 411. Whilst Constantine is away, as it were, the various peoples who, according to the ancient sources, are threatening Britain in this period continue to attack Britain, particularly people like the Picts and the Scots and the Saxons. And that sort of security crisis leads to some form of revolt in Britain around about 408 or 409. And soon thereafter, in 410, the emperor, the official emperor of the Western Empire, Honorius, apparently writes to the cities of Britain to say he can't help them, they have to look after themselves. And that is assumed to be a reply to a request for help, so it's known as a rescript. Now, there is some controversy about whether the source, Zosimus, has corruption in the text at this point, and that it might actually be all about Italy rather than Britain. Now, this is an interesting debate, and it's ongoing. As far as I can see at the moment, it's pretty much insoluble, and we should probably not worry about it too much, because there are other indications from the archaeological record that there is definitely something significant happening with the administration of Britain in around about this time, but then there are other processes we need to look at too. Certainly, Rome has troubles in this period. Visigoths are sacking Rome in that same year, so it wouldn't be surprising if the problems of Britain were far beyond the the care of Honorius at this time. And then the final data I've put there, which comes from later sources like Bede and the Gallic Chronicle, is one sort of approximation of or traditional approximation of the dates of the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, and that topic I will come on to towards the end. So historical sources give us an idea that there is a significant change in Britain. Even if the rescript of Honorius doesn't apply to Britain, there's obviously trouble with the administration and some kind of rebellion in Britain. Let's move on to the archaeological evidence, and there are some different dimensions to explore here. The first topic I want to look at is the settlement pattern, and this certainly seems to be changing quite a bit, although it's worth noting that the changes in the settlement pattern of Roman Britain are happening well before AD 410, at least in some respects. So if you take towns, for example, towns are one of the conspicuous things about the Roman occupation of Britain, which speak to its participation in the Roman Empire. And so the apparent abandonment of towns around about the end of the 4th century is quite a signal that things are changing quite a bit. A couple of things to say about that, I guess. One is that there are some towns which have occupation continuing beyond the beginning of the 5th century. The most well-known is Wroxeter, where in the region of the main civic baths, shown there, there appears to be continued occupation with changes in technology to timber buildings well into the 5th, 6th centuries, continuing, at least on some scale, not as big as the Roman town occupation through that period. However, that being said, towns have also already gone through a process of change. And in many towns, as early as the beginning of the 4th century, the public buildings, particularly the forum, basilica structures, the kind of government buildings in the heart of the towns, are not being used for the purposes of civic government, at least in the traditional Roman sense anymore. So there are signs that the late antique town is rather different, the late Roman town is rather different to the early Roman town. And that maybe speaks to a longer-term process of administrative change. Certainly something big is happening in the early 5th century, but it's not entirely novel. Similarly with forts, we have examples of sites which continue occupation well beyond about 400. Many are apparently abandoned around that time, but sites like Bird Oswald here, again, a well-known site in the archaeology of this period for its long timber building sequence, and you might be able to make out in the fort there, you can see some little logs, upstanding logs, which are marking the site of timber pillars, which framed a timber hall. And the indication here is there's a unit based at that fort, which over time is gradually becoming more and more like a Dark Age warband, based in that kind of timber structure. So continuity of occupation, not entirely continuity of the traditional function, if you like, of a Roman military base, but certainly some continuity there. But again, that's, I mean, there are other forts that have similar evidence, but not that many of them, so it kind of stands out. Again, though, with forts, there is change earlier on, and in many forts in the 4th century, there are indications of increasingly localized adaptation of the buildings of the fort. Again, I think this speaks to the theme of kind of fragmentation of the administration of Britain before AD 400 or 410 or thereabouts. With villas and farms, our information is a bit less comprehensive. These types of sites have been not excavated as concentratedly as forts and towns in the history of the archaeology of Roman Britain. But generally speaking, the impression is that villas, the more Romanized so-called type farms, hesitate to use that word, it's self-controversial, but the more architecturally elaborate farms, these are coming to an end around about 400 as well, and other farms also becoming changed at this period. So there seem to be quite a lot of changes in the settlement pattern overall, a few exceptional sites, a few signs of changes before the end of the 4th century. If we come on to material culture, we need to, more broadly, of course, architecture is material culture too, but looking at the different types of artifacts that people are using in this period and what happens to them. The key issue here is that, again, all of these things have evidence of change around about 400 or soon thereafter. Is there evidence of change beforehand? Well, in some of them, yes, there is. Is there evidence of continuity afterwards? Continuity of use? Well, again, in some of them there is. Coinage, coin supplies, as I mentioned earlier, stopped coming into Britain in the early 5th century. Slightly different dates depending on the material, bronze or silver and gold. But basically, coinage stops coming in. There is some evidence of the clipping and reuse or forging of particularly silver coins. And it's quite possible that coins are still being used quite a bit beyond the point at which new ones are arriving. But that process can only go on for so long, really, possibly 10 or 20 years. And so the end of coinage seems to be quite a significant event in terms of the official involvement of Roman government in Britain. Linked with that quite probably is the end of pottery. Pottery supplies, or pottery production rather, seems to end around this time as well, around about the first decade of the 5th century. Again, pots can be used after they've stopped being made, of course, for, well, possibly quite a long time. Hard to say for how long, but again, possibly only something like 10 or 20 years. So the main kind of material culture of Britain is, Roman Britain, is petering out in the first couple of decades of the 5th century. Pottery supply had certainly been changing a bit before this date, and this pie chart here shows the different sources of late 4th century pottery at the fort of Oswald that I was just talking about. And particularly, I guess, things like the black burnished ware, which is coming up from Dorset. That had been a major source of supply in the earlier 4th century, taking up more like half of the equivalent chart. But in the late 4th century, that's dropping back, sources of supply becoming a bit more localized. There's evidence of strain on the pottery industry in the late 4th century, but it does come to an end early in the 5th. With personal objects, things like items of personal adornment, brooches and that kind of thing. Again, there are quite a lot of late 4th century types known, but the production of new types seems largely to stop in the early 5th century. Again, some of these things were continuing to be worn and used probably for quite a long time, but without new production, then there's clearly some kind of change to the economy of Roman Britain and perhaps to the identities people are expressing through those objects. A couple of other interesting areas, epigraphy, the inscribing of Latin inscriptions on stone. Certainly, in terms of official inscriptions, we don't actually get many of those even in the 4th century. So that seems to be something that is dying off as a habit earlier on in the Roman period. Interestingly, there is a resurrection of Latin epigraphy in the western part of Britain in the 5th, from the post-Roman period on, particularly the 6th and 7th centuries. I'll come back to that a bit later. So that doesn't seem to fit with anything much at all. It ends early in terms of mainstream Roman practice and carries on later on the fringes of the Roman province. And construction materials also change, particularly this, I guess, is a late 4th or early 5th century phenomenon. The evidence for construction in stone sort of dries up, and people seem to be building in timber and indeed using earthworks to refortify forts on Hadrian's Wall, for example. So some interesting shifts there, maybe again to do with the economy, to do with supply or availability of different kinds of materials. So all these material changes, and it is a complex picture, so bear that in mind. But the changes that we've seen here relate to broader themes too. And I want to pick out a few of those that are worth thinking about. Now, one of the major ways of being Roman in Roman Britain is being a Roman citizen. In the 4th century, the freeborn population of Britain were all Roman citizens. And this is the reason why it is false and improper to talk about the Romans going home, because if that did happen, well, first of all, everyone was Roman, and their home was where they were. So where do they go? Now, the end of citizenship, though, is an interesting issue, because citizenship is linked to the administration, or it has meaning because of the Roman administration. So if the Roman administration does come to an end around about 400, then citizenship probably ceases to be a meaningful category after that, soon after that. Roman citizenship is closely linked to Roman law and to the rights citizens enjoy under Roman law. Now, there are a couple of snippets of the textual evidence that indicate some persistence of some Roman magistracies and legal frameworks beyond 400 or 410, but it's not particularly reliable evidence, and without any of the government buildings and infrastructure that we've seen in the Roman period, it's hard to imagine how that can continue for very long. Literacy is another important part of being Roman from a certain point of view, Latin literacy particularly. Now, what's interesting about that, I guess, is that literacy can be independent of the idea of being Roman. And one of the major sources, very problematic in lots of ways, one of the major sources for this period is the monk Gildas, who's a British monk writing in probably the early 6th century or the end of the 5th century. And he's writing in Latin about the end of Roman Britain, amongst other things. But he doesn't see himself as a Roman. He talks about the Romans as another people who kind of come and go in British history. And that sort of indicates, well, A, that literacy continues, at least in monasteries, well beyond AD 410, but also that by that time it may not particularly mean membership of the Roman community, at least in a sort of cultural sense rather than a religious sense. And that brings us on to religion. And religion is certainly an area where there is evidence for long continuity of Christianity in Western Britain after 400, 410, thereabouts. And that is pretty important. Again, what religion means in terms of being Roman is another question that we'll come back to a bit later. One that I put in there that may sound a bit odd is bathing. Surely people bathed even after the Romans left. Well, yes, I'm sure they did. The question is, how did they bathe? And bathing is actually one of those kind of funny things that is quite culturally specific and can have quite a lot of significance, particularly when in Roman Britain people bathed in a really quite elaborate way, involving all the kinds of hypercourse and hot and cold and warm rooms and all that kind of stuff. And there is evidence from the 4th century that maybe the particular bathing practices of Roman Britain are not so fashionable as they once were. Quite a few bathhouses including that one in the fort at Binchester, are being converted for other uses in the 4th century. So this may be an indication of a certain aspect of being Roman that's changing well before 400. So all of these kinds of things together, they give us conflicting evidence, if you like, for the cultural identity of people, whether they're Roman because they are bathing in a certain way, whether they're Roman because of their religion, whether they're Roman because they write in Latin, and each of these things kind of ends at a different point between the 4th and the 6th centuries and beyond. So that leads us on to a few sort of key questions. All this stuff, all these different things, all these complex patterns in material culture, what do they mean in terms of whether people thought they were Roman or not in the 5th century? How did the changes that we do see happen, and who did they affect? And this brings me to a quite important point. A considerable number of the things I've been talking about relate only to a fairly small percentage of the population of Roman Britain. So, for example, change in towns. Well, that seems pretty important in terms of the end of Roman things. Well, the population that lived in towns was only very small part of the population of Roman Britain. You see on the pie chart there, some of the categories that are listed don't even show up as slices of the pie. The one that is dominating that chart is the rural populace, and they're not even the rural populace who live in villas. So for them, the end of towns might have mean you don't go to the market to get your pottery anymore. Well, big deal. I mean, is that really the end of the world? The urban populace is only a pretty small percentage of the overall population. So who do these different changes affect? Certainly lots of people did use pottery in Roman Britain, but again, over a few years, which is possibly what we're talking about, things changing, is that change going to be noticeable? And then the last point there, again, sort of summarizing some of the things I've already said, all the different things that are changing, which of these can we label as Roman, which type of material culture means that you are Roman, which type of behavior means that you are Roman in this period. And things like the issue of citizenship come up there. And then what about the idea of British as well? There's another problematic term in the label of Roman Britain, and that's British. Because in this period, there is not particularly a unitary sense of being British at all. The idea of Britishness has been kind of developed during the Roman period, because that's what the Romans call the people of Britain. But more local identities seem much more important throughout the Roman period and beyond. So these are all problematic issues in terms of defining what ended, in terms of these labels of Roman and British. Now, that brings us on to some considerations to do with the chronology and sort of when things ended. And what I've tried to convey by looking at the different types of evidence is that there's a lot of overlapping kind of tempos or cycles of change. And we need to think back to a point I made earlier here in terms of events versus processes. And the different types of evidence give us different resolution on what's changing during this period. But also we need to think about the differences between people and objects. When we're talking about the changes in the archaeological record, we're talking about changes in objects. And they may or may not correspond with changes in people. The most signal case of this is, okay, if coinage and pottery stop being used in the early 5th century, well, that's fine, they disappear. But does that mean the people disappear too? Why would that happen? We need to think carefully through that process as to what the meaning of changes in objects might be. In the evidence that I've reviewed, I've tried to highlight the fact that some things change well before AD 410, some things continue later. Which is more Roman? Which is more significant? Is it significant that the urban life of Roman Britain is already changing quite a bit around about 300? What about religion continuing well beyond 410? Is that not the most important thing to being Roman in this period, being a Christian? So we have rather a lot of problems. And what's kind of interesting is that amidst these different cycles of change, the thing that does kind of fit to be finishing around about AD 410 is the end of some level of Roman administration of Britain, which corresponds not only with the historical evidence, whether or not that's accurate, but also with the end of coinage being brought into Britain and the corresponding consequences that has for the economy, particularly probably the collapse of the pottery industries is directly linked to those economic shifts following on from the end of a sort of fully fledged monetary system. So these overlapping cycles are important, but the one we might pick out as happening around about AD 410 is the end of some level of Roman administration. The question remains, though, as to whether that is a particularly important change for the majority of people in Britain. And that brings us on to another key problem, which is that Roman Britain is not a unified entity. And not only are different things changing at different times, but also they're changing at different times in different places to add further complexity. In Roman Britain, there is an increasingly recognized tendency towards regionality, that there are lots of different things happening in different regions within Britain. And these affect when these changes occur. The towns in the east change at a different time to the towns in the west, and so on. Even within the military, you get quite different patterns in the archaeology in terms of how people are living in Roman forts in the north compared to the south, the Saxon shore forts of Portchester versus forts on Hadrian's Wall. So Roman Britain is not a unified entity. We shouldn't expect things to change at an even pace across Roman Britain, geographically speaking. We shouldn't expect things to change uniformly either, because people are involved in lots of different spheres of life. Changes may have affected women more than men. They may have affected certain occupations more than others, and so on. So there's a great deal of potential complexity in unpicking these changes. Now, I'll come back to summarize a couple of those points in a few moments, but I want to come on to my last theme now, which is the question of why did it end, whatever that it means. Well, the first sort of key issue to deal with here is the role of the Anglo-Saxons. And I guess it's fairly straightforward to talk about this in the sense that the Anglo-Saxon migration is another hugely controversial area. Lots of debate over the scale of migration, what ideas of ethnicity people actually had at that moment compared to later on when the histories were being written. But in terms of the end of Roman Britain, the Anglo-Saxons had probably very little role in that process. Certainly we have these various sources telling us about raids on the Roman province from the Saxons and the Picts and the Scots as part of a security problem. But in terms of the main kind of Anglo-Saxon migrations, whatever that means, there's not a particular link with the end of Roman Britain. And indeed, it is strongly suggested from the way that later history develops that there was an institutional break between the Roman administration in Eastern Britain and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, because compared to the continent, compared to Gaul, compared to Spain and Italy, those incoming Anglo-Saxon aristocracies did not take over a sort of ongoing Roman administration that they then sort of continued to work with in terms of things like law, codes, and language, and so on. What might be an interesting sort of sidelight, though, in terms of later times, is the persistence of some sort of Roman things in the west of Britain, and indeed the reinvention or resurgence of certain conventions of Roman practice in the west. So things like the inscribed stones, particularly tombstones inscribed with Latin inscriptions, part of Western Christian culture in this period, the 6th and 7th centuries particularly. The inscription there showing that it's a tombstone of someone called Procagnus. There's a misspelling in the Latin, which is interesting. But you know, there's a new tradition there, drawing on an old practice that was never particularly common during the Roman period, but is being reinvented. And maybe this is part of the distinctions that people are drawing in Britain between the West and the East in those later centuries, and Roman things are useful in that process. It's a world that's becoming increasingly focused on the invention of ethnic identities at a fairly small scale. And it's in that context that people like Gildas the monk are writing of the Romans as if they're also an ethnic group coming and going from Britain, and that's the perception that has remained popular to this day. The real causes for the end of Roman Britain, they need to be sought within the Roman period, and they need to be understood in terms of the changes that are happening in the 4th century and indeed earlier with Roman culture. And basically, I think the answer is simply that Roman culture, political culture at least, is undergoing significant tensions in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and it's basically fragmenting. The empire is becoming too big to be ruled, and there are lots of changes, particularly in the frontier provinces, which are making them more self-sufficient, more independent. And that's reflected in the usurpers that I talked about earlier. It's reflected in lots of changes in material culture. It's reflected also in the fact that during this period, the empire is becoming increasingly centralizing in its ideology. It's trying to create the impression that all is well, that the empire is united. Even when you have 4 emperors, as at the end of the 3rd century here, the ideology that's being projected by this statue is that they're all the same person, pretty much. They get along great, as you can see, and they're ruling the empire in harmony. Of course, ideology is usually being put about because something else is happening that contradicts that story, and it's a story of fragmentation of political culture, I think, through the 4th century. And that kind of fragmentation is happening at many levels. So it's happening at the biggest level of the empire, but also within a province like Britain, which actually by the 4th century is 4, maybe 5 provinces within a structure called a diocese. And so there's sort of political fragmentation, if you like, but also from some of the archaeological patterns, which I can't go into in great detail, there is a range of sort of different things going on in the different regions of Britain, as I've already touched upon. And this also relates to the fact that the identities of people in the Roman period are certainly complicated. There are lots of different dimensions that people's lives are structured by, their individual identity, their gender, age, and status, and so on. And what I think is sort of happening in the 4th century is that the top level of identities in terms of kind of scale, things like the Roman state, are becoming ever weaker. And the transformation in political culture in the 4th century involves the kind of shearing off of the top level of that sort of diagram I've drawn up there, so that the state structure is significantly weakened. And that creates the context for whatever is specifically happening in Britain in the early 5th century. Exactly who is revolting, whether it's just the troops, whether it's the aristocracy, whether it's the peasantry, is very difficult to say. Whether it's the revolts which are pushing the Roman administration out, or whether the top level of Roman administration is withdrawing, again, very difficult to say. But whichever of those possibilities is happening, it's because the state structure has been weakened over a long time by people just kind of doing things differently within the area of Britain, as with other provinces in the West. So to sum up, I think we should admit that this is a complex problem. It is not a simple problem. No historical problem ever is a simple one. And with the end of Roman Britain, basically we need to sort of accept that there are many ends of Roman Britain. It just depends what you call Roman. It depends what aspects of people's lives that you think about most. Is it their religion? Is it their citizenship? Is it the fact that they have some top-level administrator in London or not? Is it the fact that they bathe in a certain way or whatever? There are many ends, and they have different time scales, and this is because there are many ways of being Roman and because there are many regions of Britain. So the historical process really can't be reduced to a very sort of simple equation. Something did happen in the early 5th century, though. That much seems pretty clear. From the material culture changes which are most closely linked to the Roman administration and the historical sources for whatever sort of they can indicate to us. But that administrative change, and let's say that it was basically the withdrawal of the diocesan level, the level above the provinces of administration at the least. But that change was certainly presaged by a long process of fragmentation through the 4th century. So it has, I guess, an air of inevitability about it, that whatever happened in the early 5th century, in terms of the specific details, that was sort of going to happen at some point soon anyway. And what that also leads us to conclude is that apart perhaps from some soldiers who are being taken out by Constantine III, some administrators who maybe go home to Gaul, probably, which is where they might have come from rather than Rome, the Romans didn't leave Britain because the Romans were the people of Britain. But over time, sometimes before 410, sometimes quite a lot after 410, they stopped doing the things that made them Roman, and in that process stopped thinking of themselves as Roman and came to think of the Romans as a separate people who had come and gone from British history. So, on that note, thank you very much.